The Seattle autumn painted the sky in hues of amber and gold, the leaves swirling through Fremont's quiet streets like whispers of change. In her ivy-draped craftsman home, Helen Whitaker stood in the chilly bathroom, the cold tile biting at her bare feet. At 60, the retired librarian carried an understated grace, her silver hair swept into a loose bun, her silk robe clinging softly to her frame, a quiet defiance of the years. The house, with its creaking floors and outdated fixtures, was a silent companion, its emptiness a constant reminder of her husband's passing 3 years prior. Each day, blended into the next, a rhythm of solitude, punctuated by the small rebellions of maintaining her aging home. That morning, the hot water failed again, the ancient faucet sputtering in mockery. Frustration curled in Helen's chest, mingling with the familiar ache of loneliness, a weight she'd learned to carry, but never fully accept. Every broken pipe, every flickering light was a tether to the world beyond her walls, a reason to reach out. She flipped through the worn phone book, her fingers pausing on a name that had become a quiet comfort. Lucas Reed, a plumber, whose deep, steady voice stirred something she couldn't quite name. "I can come by today," he said over the phone, his tone warm, grounding, sending a shiver through her. Helen tried to dismiss the flutter in her chest. It was just a faucet, a mundane repair in a life of routine. But when the doorbell chimed, the air shifted heavy with anticipation. She opened the door to find Lucas, 26, his rugged charm filling the entryway like a burst of sunlight. His toolbox hit the floor with a thud, his broad shoulders straining against a thin work shirt that outlined a physique both powerful and unassuming. His hazel eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a spark igniting in the quiet space between them. "This way," he asked, his voice low, steady. "Yes, just through here," Helen replied, her voice catching as she gestured down the hallway. She led him to the bathroom, her silk robe brushing against her skin, her heart betraying her with its quickening pace. Lucas's presence seemed to shrink the narrow space, his confident stride, a stark contrast to the stillness of her life. She lingered by the door, her hands fidgeting as he knelt to inspect the faucet, his movements deft assured. "Old system," he said, his voice calm, professional. "We can fix it. Might take a few hours." The words were practical, but his tone steady, almost intimate, sent a ripple of warmth through her. Helen nodded her gaze, lingering on the flex of his arms, the focus in his expression as he worked. She should have left, busied herself with the dishes or a book, but her feet stayed rooted, drawn to the vitality he exuded. "Need a towel?" he asked, pointing to a small leak pooling on the floor. "Of course," she said, moving to the cabinet, her hands trembling as she handed it to him. Their fingers brushed a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her, the air thickening with unspoken tension. "Thanks," Lucas said, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before returning to his task. Helen's heart raced her mind, a tangle of embarrassment, curiosity, and a longing she hadn't felt in years, a longing that both thrilled and terrified her. To break the silence, she ventured, "Not many young plumbers out there. How long have you been at this?" Lucas glanced over his shoulder, his gaze warm but guarded. 5 years. Started as an apprentice, then went solo. "How old are you?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of admiration, a boldness she hadn't intended. 26, he replied, his focus back on the pipes. The revelation of his youth sent a thrill through her, a mix of awe and an unexpected attraction that made her pulse quicken. "I'd have guessed older," she said, attempting a smile. "You seem so experienced." Lucas's shoulders tensed, her words catching him off guard, but he offered a small nod, his professionalism a shield. "Care for some coffee when you're done?" She offered her tone, light but hopeful, a quiet plea to extend his presence. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to hers. "Thanks, but I've got other jobs today. Need to head out after this." Disappointment stung sharp and fleeting, but his restraint only deepened her fascination. As he worked, Helen paced the small bathroom, her hands gripping the counter. her gaze drawn to his every move, the curve of his back, the precision of his hands. When he finished, he stood slinging his toolbox over his shoulder. All done. Hot water should be fine now. Call if there's an issue. I will, Helen said, leaning against the doorframe, her voice soft, almost reluctant. Thanks for being so quick. Youth's got its perks, he said, a faint smile breaking his stoic demeanor. He paused at the door as if on the verge of saying more, but simply nodded and stepped into the crisp autumn air. The house felt emptier in his wake, the silence heavier. Yet Helen's heart raced alive with a spark she couldn't ignore. Was this just a repair, or had Lucas awakened something she'd buried long ago? The next morning, the faucet betrayed her again, cold water spitting in defiance of Lucas's work. A secret thrill coursed through her as she dialed his number, her hand trembling with anticipation. "Hey, Lucas," she said, urgency lacing her voice. "The faucet's acting up again. Could you come back?" A brief pause, then his steady reply. "Sure, I'll bring spare parts. Be there in an hour." Excitement surged as she hung up her fingers, lingering on the phone. She moved to her wardrobe, her hand brushing against a black lace nightgown. A daring choice she justified as comfort, though her racing heart knew better. The mirror reflected a woman transformed, her eyes bright with anticipation, her silver hair loose, cascading over her shoulders. When the doorbell rang, she took a deep breath, smoothed the lace against her skin, and opened the door, her nightgown a bold statement of intent. Lucas's gaze flickered over her, a quick intake of breath, before he composed himself, toolbox in hand. "Hope I'm not too much trouble," Helen said, feigning nonchalance, though her pulse betrayed her. "This faucet's driving me crazy." "No problem," he said, averting his eyes as he headed to the bathroom. "I'll fix it for good this time." She followed, watching as he bent to work, his tension palpable in the tight set of his shoulders. "Does this happen often?" she asked, her voice teasing the nightgown's fabric, brushing her skin, fueling her courage. "Things you fix, breaking again." Sometimes, Lucas said, his focus on the pipes, his voice steady but strained. "But I've got everything I need to make it right this time." "You're so careful," she said, smiling, her tone warm with admiration. "Must be good at your job, even so young." Her hand brushed his arm as she reached for the faucet, a deliberate touch that made him freeze, his breath catching in his throat. The bathroom was a crucible, the air thick with unspoken desires, as Lucas worked, his movements precise but hurried, as if fleeing the tension between them. Helen leaned against the cabinet, her nightgown's strap slipping slightly, her casual pose a calculated invitation. She felt alive, reckless, the boundaries of propriety blurring with each stolen glance. The scent of her lavender perfume mingled with the metallic tang of the pipes, creating an intoxicating haze. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" She teased, her voice light, but laced with challenge, a playful dare. Lucas kept his eyes on the faucet, his breathing quickening. "Of course, it's a simple fix." "Then why does it keep breaking?" she pressed, bending to retrieve a towel from the cabinet, the strap of her nightgown falling further, exposing a hint of pale skin. Lucas's gaze lingered for a heartbeat before he tore it away, his hands tightening on the wrench, his knuckles white. "Maybe something else in here's causing trouble," he said, his voice betraying a tremor, a crack in his professional facade. "I'll figure it out." Helen straightened, stepping closer, her hand grazing his back, the touch light but electric. "It's hard to find someone as skilled as you," she said, her tone playful but heavy with intent, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. Lucas stood, his eyes meeting hers, a storm of uncertainty and desire swirling within them. "Helen." He said her name, a soft plea, his voice rough with restraint. "This job's almost done. I won't be in your way much longer." His words were a barrier, but the crack in his voice ignited a fire within her. She stepped closer, the space between them vanishing, the air electric. "What if I don't want you out of my way?" she whispered, her hand resting on his arm, her touch a spark that threatened to consume them both. Lucas's breath hitched, his resolve wavering like a flame in the wind. "This," "We can't," he said, but his eyes betrayed him, lingering on her lips, her bare shoulder, the delicate lace that barely concealed her. "Why not?" Helen pressed her voice low, daring a challenge that hung in the air like a dare. "What's stopping us?" For a moment they stood frozen, the world narrowing to the heat between them, the rapid pulse of their breaths. Then Lucas moved his hand cupping her cheek, his lips crashing into hers with a hunger that shattered her restraint. The kiss was urgent, a release of years of solitude, of desires long buried. Helen's hands found his shoulders, pulling him closer, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt as she surrendered to the fire within her. They stumbled against the counter, the nightgown slipping further her skin, alive under his touch. Lucas's hands roamed hesitant at first, then bold, exploring her with a reverence that made her heart race. "Helen," he murmured against her lips, his voice thick with conflict. "This is wrong. Then why does it feel so right?" She whispered, her fingers tangling in his hair, drawing him back to her, her body arching into his. The bathroom became their world, each touch a defiance of the boundaries they'd crossed, each kiss a reclaiming of something lost. Lucas's hands slid beneath the lace, his fingers tracing the curves of her body, igniting a heat she hadn't known in years. Helen's breath came in soft gasps, her hands guiding his, teaching him the rhythm of her desire. The faucet gleamed forgotten as they lost themselves in the moment, the world outside fading to nothing. When they parted breathless, their foreheads pressed together, the air was heavy with the weight of what they'd done. Lucas's eyes were conflicted, a storm of guilt and longing, but Helen felt only the thrill of awakening a woman reborn. "I should go," he said, his voice lacking conviction as he gathered his tools, his hands trembling. "Stay," Helen said, her hand on his wrist, her voice soft but firm. "Just for coffee." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers, then nodded a silent agreement to linger on the edge of this forbidden dance. They moved to the kitchen, the coffee machine humming to life, but the real heat was in their glances, the silences that spoke louder than words. As they sipped the dark brew, Helen's bare foot brushed against his leg under the table, a subtle tease that made him pause, his eyes darkening with desire. The coffee grew cold as their conversation turned to whispers, their hands finding each other across the table, fingers intertwining. "I've never done anything like this," Lucas admitted, his voice low, vulnerable. "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I," Helen said, her thumb brushing against his hand, her heart pounding. "But I don't want it to stop." He leaned across the table, kissing her again, softer this time, but no less intense, a promise of more to come. The kitchen became a sanctuary. The world outside, a distant memory, as they explored the boundaries of their desire, each touch a step deeper into the unknown. Weeks passed, and their encounters grew bolder, each visit from Lucas, a descent into a secret world of stolen moments. He returned under the guise of repairs, a flickering light, a creaky floorboard, but the true fix was in the fire. They kindled the house, thrumming with a life it hadn't known in years. Helen's craftsman home, once a tomb of loneliness, became a stage for their forbidden dance, its walls echoing with whispered promises and the soft rustle of lace. Each visit began with a pretense Lucas arriving with his toolbox, his work shirt clinging to his frame, his hazel eyes searching hers for permission. Helen greeted him in outfits that grew bolder, a sheer blouse that hinted at the curves beneath a silk robe left loosely tied, a short dress that hugged her hips. She'd linger as he worked her presence, a quiet invitation, her touches deliberate, a hand on his shoulder, a brush of her fingers against his back. The air was always charged, the tension building, until one of them broke their lips, meeting in a rush of heat that erased the world outside. One rainy afternoon, as Lucas knelt to fix a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink, Helen stood close, her bare legs inches from his hands. She wore a thin camisole, the fabric clinging to her skin, her perfume a subtle lure. "You're here a lot lately," she teased, her voice, low, playful. "People might start to talk." Lucas paused, his wrench still, his eyes flicking to hers. "Let them," he said, his voice rough with defiance, a spark of rebellion that thrilled her. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his thigh, her touch a spark that ignited the air. "Careful," she whispered, her lips grazing his ear, "or I might keep breaking things just to keep you here." He turned his hands, finding her waist, pulling her against him as their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce. The kitchen floor became their sanctuary, the rain outside a soft curtain shielding them from the world. Lucas's hands slid beneath her camisole, his fingers tracing the lines of her body, each touch a declaration of desire. Helen arched into him, her breath hitching her hands, guiding his, teaching him the rhythm of her pleasure. Their encounters were a delicate balance of passion and secrecy, each moment a risk they willingly took. Lucas would linger after his work, their conversations stretching into the night, their bodies entwined on the couch, the bed, the kitchen counter. Helen felt alive, her solitude shattered by the heat of his touch, the intensity of his gaze. But with each stolen moment, the shadow of guilt grew a quiet reminder of the boundaries they'd crossed. The neighborhood with its watchful eyes began to whisper. Helen noticed the sidelong glances from neighbors, the hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. She dismissed them at first, lost in the thrill of Lucas's presence, but the weight of their judgment began to press against her. She was 60, a widow, a woman expected to live quietly, respectably. Lucas was young, vibrant, a man who should be building a life with someone his own age. Their connection, though undeniable, was a scandal waiting to erupt. One evening, as Lucas lingered in her kitchen, his shirt unbuttoned, his hands resting on her hips, a sharp knock at the door shattered their reverie. Helen froze, her heart pounding, as Lucas stepped back, his eyes wary. She smoothed her dress, her hands trembling, and opened the door to find Margaret, her oldest friend, standing on the porch. Margaret's expression was a mix of concern and accusation, her eyes narrowing as she glanced past Helen into the house. "Helen, we need to talk." Margaret said, her voice low, urgent. "What's going on with that plumber? People are talking and it's not good." Helen's stomach twisted, the truth looming like a storm cloud. "It's nothing," she said, her voice unsteady, a lie that felt hollow even to her. "He's just fixing things." Margaret's gaze softened, but her tone was firm. "Helen, I know you're lonely, but it's dangerous. You're not thinking straight. What happens when this gets out? Your reputation, your life here, it could all fall apart." Lucas emerged from the kitchen, his shirt hastily buttoned, his presence a silent confession. Margaret's eyes widened, her lips tightening, but she said nothing, her silence a judgment heavier than words. "I should go." Lucas said, his voice low, his eyes meeting Helen's with a promise of return. As he slipped out the door, closing behind him, Helen faced Margaret, her heart a battlefield of defiance and shame. "I'm not a fool, Margaret," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know what this looks like, but I'm alive again." "Can't you see that?" Margaret sighed, her expression softening. "I see it, Helen, but at what cost? You're playing with fire and it's going to burn you." Alone again, Helen moved to the mirror, her reflection a study in contrast. The woman she'd been quiet and restrained, and the woman she'd become bold and awakened. Lucas had ignited a fire within her, one that burned through her solitude, her fears, her carefully constructed life. But Margaret's words lingered, a warning of the reckoning to come. The next time Lucas arrived, the air was heavier, their touches tinged with urgency, as if they sensed the fragility of their secret. They made love in the bedroom. The sheets tangled their bodies, a defiance of the world outside. Afterward, as they lay together, Helen traced the lines of his face, her heart aching with the weight of what they'd built. "What are we doing, Lucas?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I can't stop. I don't want to." She kissed him soft and slow, a silent vow to hold on, even as the world closed in. The whispers grew louder, the neighbors' glances sharper, and Helen knew the dance couldn't last forever. One day the truth would demand its price, her reputation, her place in this quiet community, perhaps even Lucas himself. But for now, she clung to the fire, to the man who'd awakened her, to the life she dared to reclaim. As the autumn leaves fell, Helen stood at her window, watching the world shift, her heart a battlefield of love and fear. The dance had begun, its steps bold and reckless, but its final notes would test her courage, her passion, and the woman she'd fought to become.